Last but not least, I present to you our final presenter, Professor Ben Powell. Professor Powell teaches economics at Texas Tech University and is the executive director of the Free Market Institute. Professor Powell holds PhD in sociology from George Mason University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Powell.
All right, thank you. It's good to be with you, though. I wish I were there in person, and that's mostly because as a DC think tank event, I assume there's some cocktail hour at the end of this for the in-person attendees that I'm going to be missing out on, but I just realized maybe I can do that virtually too by running up a bar tab here in Lubbock and sending my receipt to the Atlantic Council and seeing if Dan approves it. Regardless of how that works out, what I'm here to do is talk to you today about the causal relationship between economic freedom and prosperity. And this is joint work with two of my colleagues here at Texas Tech, Jamie Pavlik and Andrew Young, all three of whom are economists, by the way, not sociologists. Next slide, please. So we kind of frame our chapter we wrote for the book with Adam Smith on both the front and the back of it, or as my friend Deirdre McCloskey refers to him, the blessed Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, nearly 250 years ago, wrote, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." Or in other words, economic freedom. Next slide, please. So here's what we do. We set out to establish a causal relationship, not just a correlation, between economic freedom and prosperity. And obviously using the Atlantic Council's new index of economic freedom, which, as you've heard in previous talks, has four main areas of property rights, trade freedom, investment freedom, and women's economic freedoms. And the way we're going to go about this is first, we're going to consider, at least briefly, some economic theory, because when people point out statistical correlations, they'll say, yes, but that doesn't establish a causation. Well, we have economics, and economic science is about theory that talks about directions of causation. So it's at least worth thinking about to start with. How do the various components of this index, in theory, how would they translate into prosperity? So we'll do that first, and then we'll look at data analysis, establishing some correlations, but then using modern matching methods to establish causal empirical connections between this new measure of economic freedom and measures of prosperity. Next slide, please. So first, in theory, let's take each one of these four main subcomponent areas. First, property rights. These are the bedrock of any market economy. We need notions of mine and thine before we can have exchange. And how property rights vary between countries, they're not an all or nothing, a one or a zero. They vary in their degree of completeness and their degree of security. So when we think about more complete property rights, we're thinking about bundles of rights of things that you can do with what you have private property and what you own. So you could have use rights, ways to use the property in many ways that you see fit. You have exclusion rights, the ability to exclude others from using your rightful property. Then you have transfer rights, the ability to transfer it to others on mutually agreeable terms, including market exchanges for mutually agreed upon prices. And even in a relatively free country with relatively complete property rights like the United States, these things vary and are incomplete on many margins. I mean, at its most basic level, we own ourselves and our own body, and we can use it how we see fit in lots of ways, but not always. For instance, trading your body for sex is prohibited in the United States. That's one limitation on it. Or thinking about ownership of your body in terms of your organs, I can give away a kidney, but I cannot sell it for market exchange. So the transfer rights, the terms of the exchange for that are limited. Or for that matter, our labor, alienating our labor, we're allowed to do it, but only for prices that the government allows. So we have minimum wages that prevent some transactions. So we have relatively complete property rights in the United States, but there's lots of margins where you could think about different types of property in the United States where the government puts prohibitions or limitations on the types of exchanges or uses you can put it to. But we also vary across countries in the security. Regardless of how complete the property rights are, they can be more or less secure. If you cannot defend them from criminals invading your property or using it for themselves, or for that matter, the government through nationalizations, through regulations, through things like eminent domain, if we're thinking about real property, of taking your property and using it for themselves. So the more complete and the more secure property rights are, the more functional your market economy is going to be in generating the prices that show the real scarcity of resources. When we don't have complete property rights, then prices don't reflect the real scarcity, and we don't communicate the right information and incentives to entrepreneurs to mobilize that property for highest uses. For example, one thing that I mentioned earlier was kidneys. I'm talking to a room full of people, most of whom have 2 functioning kidneys. Yet there are many people on a wait list in the United States who value one functioning kidney probably much higher than many of you in the room do value your second functioning kidney. But because we don't have complete property rights in that, we're not allowed to exchange them for money, which doesn't generate prices that incentivize people to then put their kidneys on the market. Love ain't enough. We need some more incentives there too. So prices are the indicator of relative scarcity, and they're the byproduct of property rights in market exchange. So as we have more complete and more secure property rights, we're going to have better incentives to maintain our resources. We're going to incentivize entrepreneurs to come up with ways to mobilize those resources and transfer them to the people who place the highest values on them. And that this process has to be continually rediscovered in a market economy. So over time, we would expect places with more complete, more secure property rights to generate higher levels of economic prosperity. Trade freedom, similarly, as we have greater amount of exports, we're able to expand domestic production. We can lower our fixed cost per unit across more units, creating greater prosperity. Meanwhile, imports bring us the raw materials, the components, the intermediate goods that go into our production processes. And when they can be produced more cheaply abroad, they allow us to produce more here domestically, which then would generate more prosperity. Furthermore, trade freedom integrates your domestic economy into the global one, so that prices reflect the real relative scarcities across countries, so that you don't waste resources making stuff at home that you could be doing abroad. Take a look at a country like Cuba that is not well integrated into the global market economy. Go there and there's a theme. It's opposite of the old TV show. It's called The Price is Wrong. The prices don't reflect global relative scarcities in Cuba because they're not well integrated into the market economy. And these trade restrictions are ultimately really a restriction on property rights, as they limit the way in which you can make transfers with people made who happen to be born across lines that politicians drew on maps that demarcate different countries. Next slide, please. So continuing with this, then investment freedom. This is just allowing property rights in capital creation. So this is how we create the capital that makes us prosperous. It provides prices that guide the entrepreneurs to tell them what capital to create, which business lines to put it into, in order to generate the greatest amount of prosperity. It's essential for long-run economic planning, another form of property rights. Finally, women's economic freedom. Well, listen, roughly half the population of most countries is women. Julian Simon long ago pointed out that humans are the ultimate resource. It's our creativity that creates prosperity. It's our human ingenuity. There are no natural resources without humans. There's just nature. It's human ingenuity that turns them into resources. And these things have to be discovered. And if women don't have the same economic freedom as men, you're taking roughly half the population and stifling the knowledge discovery process that they're capable of generating that would make us more prosperous. So I think we have good theoretical reasons to think that there should be some causation running from greater economic freedoms as measured by the Atlantic Council Index to prosperity. Next slide, please. So now we're going to investigate an empirical approach using the Freedom Index. And we use this rather than the other two parts of the index for a couple reasons. One, I think actually the theoretical connection in direction of causation from freedoms to prosperity is stronger from the economic one, although not absent from the other two, but just stronger for the economic one. And two, time period of analysis, the economic freedom is able to vary more over this 20-year time horizon we have, and the manifestation of its effects is able to come into play a little bit quicker than some of those other areas. So we're limited by the data that we have. This is a new index, which is great for 2021. And thankfully, the Atlantic Council went in 5-year increments 20 years back, backdating it so that we have more to deal with here to establish this relationship. So we're going to look at both GDP per capita as a measure of prosperity, and also in one instance, the new prosperity index. And then I'll talk when we get into matching methods of why we can't do that in the second case. And we're going to first look at correlations of the levels and then the causal relationship. And I'll try to keep this fairly intuitive for us. Next slide, please. So this is looking at simple regression results, ordinary least squares, of relationship between economic freedom and measures of prosperity. In the first column, using the new prosperity index, and in the second column, using GDP per capita. And we put in lagged values for the other things that we also think would affect prosperity, either measured by the index or by GDP per capita, such as human capital, the level of investment, government expenditures as a percent of GDP, its exports, the Polity index, inflation, and we have controls for which year of those 4 years that we're in there too. For any unique factors, say like in 2021, the effects of COVID being in there. And what we established between levels of economic freedom and levels of prosperity is a strong correlation. And this has been found in other work that the Atlantic Council itself has published with its index. But the reason we're doing this here first in our chapter before moving on to the matching is so that we can see, look, the relationship there with the prosperity index when we do levels. We're also finding it similarly with GDP per capita. I'll put these into, so by the way, every statistics or economic students knows you see asterisks, that means statistical significance. More asterisks, more statistical significance. And then the numbers in front of those are the magnitude of the coefficients, which I'll interpret for you in the more meaningful ones in just a moment. But what we're finding here is both the prosperity index and the GDP per capita is tied to levels of economic freedom. To put that into quantitative terms for you, next slide, please. So one standard deviation in economic freedom in this index is about 17 points. Well, that's a massive difference in GDP per capita. Being 17 points higher than another country gets you about 1/3 higher GDP per capita. Now, in terms of thinking about reforms, it's going to be very unlikely that any country makes a 17-point jump in one of these 5-year periods. The standard or the average change over the 5-year period is about 1.5 points in economic freedom. Well, using these same regressions, we can translate that into wealth. That's about 3% higher. It's 3 percentage points higher GDP per capita, a fairly significant magnitude of effect. Now, we all know correlation is not causation, and that there's limitations to these regression results. One, you're treating all countries the same when interpreting these. So the same movement in a high freedom country like the US and a low freedom country like Congo is interpreted and given the same weights. It interprets the change in freedom regardless of where it is on the scale the same, as in if you started with 0 freedom and moved to 10, that would be treated mathematically equivalent to being at 90 and moving to 100. But there's good reasons to think that that's probably not true. It might well be if you have no economic freedom, getting 10 out of 100 points doesn't do much for you because you're still a mess almost across the board. And it also could be that if you have 90% of the index is economic freedom, getting that last 10% might not give you much extra either because you're most of the way there. Where that sweet spot in the middle could vary, but either way, it's probably not a linear relationship as would be assumed by that model. So next slide, please. What the kind of more innovative thing in our chapter that we do is we use what's called matching methods, which is one of the newer techniques in empirical economics to establish causation or an empirical causal relationship. And for this, what we're going to do, instead of levels, we're going to look at changes. So how does a 5-year change in freedom impact growth the next 5 years? So it's not happening contemporaneously. Now, we can't do this with the prosperity index. We're going to do it with GDP per capita. And the reason why, the prosperity index, I think, is good. It's a good long-term measure of well-being. But some of its components just aren't going to be very sensitive over any 5-year period to changing very much. Like make a big change in freedom and your economic processes can changing, but measuring things like health as measured by life expectancy. Well, you might be changing the capital in the medical industry and stuff, and you're getting better, more nutritious food. But for all of this to build up and take its effect in terms of life expectancy, that's going to be a much longer term process, certainly not 5 years. Ditto probably for environment when we're looking at clean water and things like that. So that's partly why we did those correlations first, is to say, hey, prosperity index and GDP per capita, both of them have this relationship. Now, when we get into the causal stuff for shorter periods and changes, we're going to be able to do this with just GDP per capita. So intuitively, here's how matching methods work. Instead of comparing all countries with each other, what we're going to do is we're going to identify countries that have made a big jump. So a jump in economic freedom, and we're going to match them to other countries that would be otherwise identical, but didn't make that same jump. So basically, make this intuitive. So in 2006, one of these countries that would be making the jump is the Republic of Georgia. Now, you can't compare that to a country like the United States and say, well, how did Georgia's jump in economic freedom create growth for them compared to the US. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at countries that 5 years prior looked a lot like Georgia in terms of their economic freedom, their political freedom, their starting GDP per capita, the human capital, all those other controls that we had in there before. And we call these things nearest neighbors. And we're going to compare each one of these countries that makes a jump to the country in the world that was most like them across all those other margins, then an average of the 2 countries that were most like them across those margins. Then we'll compare them to 3 countries and 4 countries averages that were most like them. And how we're going to define our jumps here is 3.5 point increase in economic freedom. So a little bit more than twice what the average increase was. So we're not looking for just little small tweaks here. We're saying, hey, if you make some reforms and significantly improve economic freedom, does that translate into growth? And doing it at twice the average gets you 91 cases. So there's 91 countries that made a jump, or 91 country time pairs where a jump that big happened. And then we're also going to say, how about a really big change? How about a 7-point change? So twice that. And then we're going to have 29 cases where there was a jump that big that we can evaluate. So next slide, please. So the top one of these 2 tables is the first one, a 3.5 jump. And where you see the top horizontal row across there, that's nearest neighbors of the 1 most like it, the 2 most like it, the 3 most like it, and the 4 most like it. And we're looking to see how did the jump in freedom impact GDP growth compared to them. And in all of these cases, the coefficients are positive, indicating GDP growth was bigger in the country that jumped in economic freedom. Now, just to there's a trade-off, of course, by the way, and this is why you do it for a few groups of nearest neighbors. And that's that, the nearest neighbor, that's the country most like them. But of course, if there was any one idiosyncratic shock in whoever that country happens to be, well, then you might not be picking up the true relationship. Go to 2, and now you average it out, you start to get rid of those idiosyncratic shocks, but at the expense of the average being less exactly like the country you're analyzing. Ditto on out to 4. Well, what do you see then? You see the asterisks start appearing once we get rid of idiosyncratic shocks. The 2 most near neighbors, 10% statistical significance, and then up to 95 on the 3rd and the 4th. Drop down to the bottom, and I'll again give you magnitudes in just 1 second to interpret these. Drop down to the bottom, these are your bigger jumps in freedom, the 7-point jumps. And again, you get the same thing. Once you iron out idiosyncratic shocks by getting averages of 2, 3, and 4 neighbors, you find significance at the 1% level, along with positive coefficients indicating greater growth. And these are significant in magnitude. Next slide, please. So quantifying this, so when we compare them to only like countries, when we do this matching and hold the other characteristics constant, so what we're really trying to pick up on is what's the effect of just this change in economic freedom when we compare it to otherwise similar places that didn't get this. 3.5 point increase in economic freedom is associated with an increase in GDP levels over a 5-year period of 6 to 8 percentage points, depending which one of those nearest neighbor ones you look at. A significant increase in prosperity, I would say. And now a 7-point increase, a bigger economic reform, translates into even greater prosperity, nearly 10 to 15 percentage points higher in terms of GDP per capita at the conclusion of a 5-year period. This is signaling a strong and meaningful, large causal relationship between economic freedom and GDP per capita or prosperity. Next slide, please. So wrapping up, what I'd say is theory, correlation, causal inference. These all indicate the same thing, that economic freedom is an important determinant of prosperity, or in other words, the blessed Adam Smith was right. Thank you.